He appears in 3 verses. 3 verses in the book of Genesis, spread across a single paragraph, and then he is gone. No origin story, no genealogy, no death, no tomb, no record of where he came from or where he went. He walks into one of the oldest narratives in the Bible, performs an act of blessing, receives a tithe from one of the most significant figures in all of human history, and then vanishes as quietly as he arrived. His name is Melchizedek. And the questions his 3 verses generate have occupied theologians, scholars, mystics, and careful readers for over 3,000 years. Who was he? Where did he come from? How does a man appear in the narrative with no father, no mother, no genealogy, in a text that is obsessed with genealogy, that traces lineage with meticulous care across hundreds of years and simply exist without explanation, as though the universe had always contained him? Those 3 verses in Genesis are only the beginning, because Melchizedek does not stay in Genesis. He reappears 1,000 years later in a single line of a psalm written by David. And then, 14 centuries after Genesis, a letter in the New Testament spends more sustained attention on this figure than on almost any other subject it addresses. The author of Hebrews returns to Melchizedek again and again, treating him not as a historical curiosity, but as a key, the key, perhaps to understanding something about Jesus that no other category in the Hebrew Bible could adequately express. 3 verses in Genesis, 1 line in the Psalms, 2 full chapters in Hebrews, and between them, centuries of silence in which the rabbis argued, the apocalyptic writers speculated, and a community living in caves near the Dead Sea produced a document suggesting that Melchizedek was something more than human. This is that story. To understand why the appearance of Melchizedek is so startling, you have to understand the world he steps into, and that means understanding Abram. The year is somewhere around 2000 BC. A man named Abram, who will later be renamed Abraham, is living in the ancient Near East. He is not a young man. He is 75 years old when the story we are interested in begins, already past the stage of life when most people expect their circumstances to change dramatically. But something dramatic has just happened to him. God spoke to him, not through a prophet, not through a priest or an intermediary, directly. And what God said was specific enough to stake a life on. Leave your country, your people, your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Abram went. What follows in the early chapters of Genesis is a portrait of a man navigating the tension between a promise that sounds impossible and a world that is not cooperating with it. He has no children, the prerequisite for becoming a great nation. He is living as an outsider in a land that belongs to other people. He has wealth in terms of livestock and servants, but no land, no standing, no political power. The incident that brings Melchizedek into the story begins with a war. Genesis 14 records what scholars sometimes call the Battle of the 4 Kings against 5 kings, a conflict between 2 coalitions of city-states and regional powers in the ancient Near East. It is one of the most historically specific passages in all of Genesis, naming kings, places, and details that suggest a genuine historical event rather than a symbolic narrative. The 4-king coalition wins. They plunder the cities of the plain, Sodom, Gomorrah, and their allies. And among the captives they take is a man named Lot. Lot was Abram's nephew. And when Abram heard that Lot had been taken, he did something that reveals the kind of man he was. He armed 318 trained men from his household, his own private military, and pursued the victorious coalition. He caught them, defeated them in a night raid, recovered all the plunder, and brought Lot and the other captives home. This is important. Abram is not a passive figure in the biblical narrative. He is a man of substance, military capability, and decisive action. When his family is threatened, he moves, and he wins. It is on his return from this victory that Melchizedek appears. Genesis 14:18-20, 3 verses. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High. And he blessed Abram, saying, Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. And praise be to God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand. Then Abram gave him a tenth of everything. Read it slowly, because almost every word carries weight. Melchizedek is identified as the king of Salem. Salem, the city that would eventually become Jerusalem. The oldest tradition of identification, shared across Jewish, Christian, and Islamic interpretation, is that Salem and Jerusalem are the same place. The psalmist makes this identification explicit in Psalm 76, and if that is correct, then Melchizedek is not a wandering figure from nowhere. He is the king of the city that will later become the most theologically significant city in the history of the world. He is also identified as a priest, king, and priest simultaneously. This combination is not ordinary in the ancient world, and it is particularly extraordinary in the world the Bible is constructing. In the Mosaic Law, which comes later, the roles of king and priest are carefully separated. Kings are from the tribe of Judah. Priests are from the tribe of Levi. The two roles are not combined. The story of King Uzziah, who tried to enter the temple and offer incense, is a story about the catastrophic consequences of crossing that boundary, and he was struck with leprosy immediately. The separation of these roles was considered sacred. Melchizedek holds both. Before the Mosaic Law exists, before the division of roles, before the tribe of Levi is even born, he is already king and priest simultaneously of the city that will one day be called Jerusalem. He is a priest of God Most High. The Hebrew phrase is El Elyon, God Most High. This is significant because it is a name for God that transcends ethnic and national boundaries. It is not the personal name Yahweh, the covenant name that God uses with Israel specifically. It is a more universal designation. And Abram, when he responds to the king of Sodom in the verses that follow, uses the same name, the Lord, God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. He recognizes Melchizedek's God as his God. The priest of El Elyon and the servant of Yahweh are worshiping the same deity. He brings bread and wine. The simplicity of this act is easy to pass over, but it will become important later. Bread and wine. The two elements that, 14 centuries later, Jesus takes at a table in Jerusalem, the city that sits on the ground where Salem stood, and says, This is my body, this is my blood. He blesses Abram. And here is where we need to stop, because the direction of this blessing is theologically explosive. The greater blesses the lesser. This is not a convention, it is a principle the author of Hebrews will make explicit. When a superior blesses an inferior, it is the superior's authority that makes the blessing meaningful. When a priest pronounces a blessing, it is effective because the priest stands in a position of spiritual authority that the person being blessed does not hold. Melchizedek blessed Abram. This is the man whom God had chosen to be the father of all nations, the man to whom the promises had been given, the man whose faith was counted to him as righteousness, the man from whose line the entire covenant people would descend. And Melchizedek, this figure of unknown origin who appears from nowhere, blesses him as one who has the authority to do so. And Abram gave him a tenth of everything, a tithe, the earliest recorded act of tithing in the biblical narrative. Not a tithe to the Levitical priesthood, that system does not yet exist. A tithe to Melchizedek, priest of God Most High, because Abram recognized in him a spiritual authority worthy of that acknowledgement. 3 verses. Then he is gone. No further mention in Genesis. No death recorded. No descendants listed. No city named after him. No tradition preserved about what happened to him after this encounter. He is in the text for one moment, and then the text moves on, as though his presence required no further explanation. But it does require explanation, because the questions those 3 verses generate are not small. Between Genesis 14 and the next appearance of Melchizedek, roughly 1,000 years pass. During those 1,000 years, the descendants of Abraham become a nation. They are enslaved in Egypt, freed by Moses, given a law at Sinai, and led into a promised land. They establish a kingdom under Saul, and then under David, who conquers Jerusalem, the city that was Salem, and makes it the capital of his kingdom. Under David's son Solomon, the temple is built on the hill that stands above the city, and the Levitical priesthood takes up permanent residence in the place that Melchizedek once ruled. Melchizedek is not mentioned in any of this. Through the entire period of the judges, the entire reign of Saul, the establishment of the Davidic kingdom, the construction of the temple, not a word. And then, in Psalm 110, David writes something that will become one of the most quoted texts in the entire New Testament. Psalm 110 is a royal psalm, a psalm addressed to a king. The first verse is, "The Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet." This single verse is quoted, or alluded to, more times in the New Testament than any other Old Testament text. Jesus uses it to confound the Pharisees. Peter uses it in his Pentecost sermon. The book of Hebrews builds its entire Christology around it. But it is the fourth verse that concerns us here. The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever, in the order of Melchizedek. This verse is extraordinary for several reasons. First, God is swearing an oath. This is not a common occurrence in the biblical text. When God swears, the text presents it as an act of particular solemnity, God binding himself by his own character, because there is nothing greater by which to swear. He swore to Abraham, and the writer of Hebrews will later observe that the oath to Abraham was the guarantee that made the covenant unbreakable. Here, he swears again, will not change his mind. Permanent. Irrevocable. Second, he is swearing that someone will be a priest, but not a Levitical priest, not a priest in the order of Aaron, a priest in the order of Melchizedek. This is a new category. Or rather, it is a very old category, one that preceded the Levitical system, and, the verse implies, supersedes it. Third, and this is where it becomes genuinely strange, David, who is writing this psalm, is from the tribe of Judah. He cannot be a Levitical priest. His descendants cannot be Levitical priests. And yet God is swearing that one of his descendants will be a priest, not in the order of Levi, in the order of Melchizedek. David wrote this psalm. He preserved it. It became part of the Psalter, the worship book of Israel, sung in the temple, read in synagogues, memorized across generations. For roughly 500 years after David, no one could quite explain what the fourth verse meant, a priest after the order of Melchizedek. Who, when, how? The silence around Melchizedek continued, but now it was a different kind of silence, not the silence of forgetting, the silence of waiting for an explanation that had not yet arrived. But while the biblical text remained silent for centuries, the Jewish mind did not. Long before the New Testament authors took up their pens, the theological atmosphere of the Second Temple period was already electric with speculation. A bridge was being built in the hearts of the faithful, connecting the ancient king of Salem to a future cosmic deliverer. In 1947, a young Bedouin shepherd threw a stone into a cave near the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea and heard the sound of pottery breaking. What he had found, and what subsequent archaeological work would reveal, was one of the most significant manuscript discoveries in modern history, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Documents produced by a Jewish community living at a site called Qumran, composed and copied between roughly the 2nd century BC and the 1st century AD. Among those documents was a text now known as 1:1 Melchizedek. Its fragmentary portions are missing, and scholars have worked for decades to reconstruct its full shape, but what survives is remarkable. The Qumran community, who were deeply eschatological in their outlook and believed they were living in the last days before a great divine intervention, developed an elaborate theology of Melchizedek, that goes well beyond anything in the canonical Hebrew Scriptures. In 1:1 Melchizedek, Melchizedek is not a human king-priest of ancient Jerusalem. He is a heavenly figure, a divine warrior, a celestial being who presides over the final judgment, who proclaims liberty to the captives and forgives sins, who stands at the head of an army of holy ones and brings about the ultimate defeat of evil at the end of the age. The document weaves together several Old Testament passages, Isaiah 61, Leviticus 25, Daniel 9, Psalm 82, and applies them all to Melchizedek. The year of Jubilee, in which debts are cancelled and captives freed, is interpreted as an eschatological event presided over by Melchizedek. He is described in language that sounds, in places, almost divine. Scholars debate exactly what the Qumran community believed about Melchizedek's nature. Was he an angel, a divine being, a glorified human? End quote. The text does not provide a systematic answer. What it does provide is evidence that in the period immediately before and during the time of Jesus, at least some Jewish communities were thinking about Melchizedek in terms that went far beyond a historical curiosity from Genesis 14. He was, for them, a figure whose story was not finished, a figure whose significance was cosmic rather than merely historical, a figure who would have a role to play in the final chapter of human history. The community that produced 1:1 Melchizedek was probably not known to the early Christians. The scrolls were sealed in their caves when the Romans destroyed Qumran around 68 AD, and they remained hidden for nearly 2,000 years. But the theological ferment they represent, the wrestling with Melchizedek's identity, the sense that his brief appearance in Genesis pointed to something enormous, was not unique to Qumran. It was in the air of Second Temple Judaism, and it was the background against which the author of Hebrews would write. The letter to the Hebrews is not like other letters in the New Testament. It does not begin with greetings. It does not identify its author. It opens with one of the most elevated pieces of prose in the entire New Testament. In the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets at many times and in various ways, but in these last days he has spoken to us by his Son, and it proceeds to build what is, in effect, a sustained theological argument addressed to Jewish Christians who are being pressured to return to the Mosaic system. The argument is long and complex, but its center of gravity is this: Jesus is better, better than the angels, better than Moses, better than Joshua, better than the Levitical priesthood. Everything the Old Covenant system was, the tabernacle, the sacrifices, the priesthood, the law, was a shadow, a preview, a copy of something that had not yet arrived. Jesus is the reality to which all of those shadows pointed. And to make that argument about the priesthood, to explain how Jesus can be a priest when he is from the tribe of Judah and not from Levi, the author of Hebrews goes back to Melchizedek. The author first mentions Melchizedek in chapter 5, almost as a passing reference, calling Jesus a high priest in the order of Melchizedek, quoting Psalm 110:4. Then he stops and makes a striking admission. He has more to say about this, he tells his readers, but it is hard to explain, not because the argument is weak, but because it requires a level of theological engagement that his readers may not be ready for. We have much to say about this, but it is hard to make it clear to you because you no longer try to understand. He calls them mature enough for solid food versus milk. He gives them a brief warning about spiritual immaturity. And then, in chapter 7, he delivers the full argument. It is worth following carefully because it is one of the most intricate pieces of biblical reasoning in the entire New Testament canon. He starts with Genesis 14. Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of God Most High, met Abraham returning from the battle and blessed him. Abraham gave him 1/10 of everything. Now, the author says, observe, his name means king of righteousness, and king of Salem means king of peace. Without father, without mother, without genealogy, without beginning of days or end of life like the Son of God, he remains a priest forever. That phrase, without father, without mother, without genealogy, without beginning of days or end of life, is one of the most debated phrases in the entire New Testament. What does it mean? The author is not making a metaphysical claim about Melchizedek's ontology. He is not saying that Melchizedek literally had no parents or that he never died. He is making a point about what the biblical text does and does not record. In the genealogy-obsessed world of the Hebrew Scriptures, where the legitimacy of a priest depended entirely on being able to trace his lineage back to Levi through Aaron, Melchizedek's priesthood has no genealogical basis. It is not derived from ancestry. It is not dependent on family line. It simply exists, without recorded beginning, without recorded end. And this, the author argues, is the point. Melchizedek appears in the text as a type, a prefiguration of a priesthood that does not depend on hereditary succession. A priesthood that is not temporary, not bound to the death of the priest who holds it, not contingent on the ability to produce genealogical credentials. The author then makes two arguments from the Abraham-Melchizedek encounter that he treats as decisive. The first argument is from the tithe. Abraham gave Melchizedek a tenth of everything. And since Levi was, in a sense, still in Abraham's loins, not yet born, but present in Abraham as a descendant, when Abraham paid the tithe, Levi paid the tithe. The entire Levitical priesthood, through its ancestor Abraham, acknowledged the superiority of Melchizedek's priesthood by paying tribute to it. The priesthood that would come through Levi was already, in the person of its ancestor, subordinating itself to the order of Melchizedek. The second argument is from the blessing. The lesser is blessed by the greater. Melchizedek blessed Abraham. Abraham is the father of the nation. Abraham is the one to whom the promises were given. And yet Melchizedek blessed him, which means Melchizedek holds a position of spiritual authority that even Abraham, even the recipient of the original covenant, acknowledges. From these two observations, the author draws a conclusion that is the heart of his entire argument. If perfection could have been attained through the Levitical priesthood, and the law was given to the people on the basis of that priesthood, why was there still need for another priest to come, one in the order of Melchizedek, not in the order of Aaron? Because perfection was not attained through it. The Levitical system was always provisional, always pointing forward. And when a different priest arises, one not from Levi, not from Aaron, but from Judah, from David's line, a priest declared by God's oath to be a priest forever, in the order of Melchizedek, the change of priesthood necessarily involves a change in the law. The old system is superseded, not abolished, superseded. The copy is replaced by the original. The shadow gives way to the substance. Before we go further, there is something in the name itself worth examining, because the author of Hebrews draws attention to it, and the attention is not accidental. Melchizedek. The name is Hebrew. It is a compound of two words, melech, which means king, and tzedek, which means righteousness. So, the name itself means king of righteousness, or righteous king, or king who is righteous. The exact nuance of the compound depends on how you read it, but the meaning cluster is unmistakable. And he is king of Salem. The author of Hebrews translates Salem correctly, following a long tradition as peace, shalom. So, Melchizedek is the king of righteousness, who rules over the city of peace. These are not incidental details. They are, for the author of Hebrews, part of the point. The priest-king who appears in Genesis is named and located in a way that makes him a living embodiment of two of the most central concepts in the entire biblical narrative, righteousness and peace. The prophets had described the coming Messiah in exactly these terms. Isaiah 9 describes a son whose government would bring endless peace on the throne of David. Jeremiah 23 gives the Messiah the name, the Lord our righteousness. The Psalms are full of the hope for a king who would reign in righteousness and peace. Melchizedek carries both names. Before David, before the prophets, before the messianic expectations had fully formed. He is named King of Righteousness and King of Peace, and he rules in the city that David will one day conquer and make the dwelling place of the divine name. This is not coincidence. It is, the New Testament argues, architectural. The structure of the story was built to carry this weight. The name was chosen or preserved because it pointed somewhere. There is a question the careful reader cannot avoid. If Melchizedek is so significant, if his priesthood is the template for the most important priestly office in the entire biblical narrative, why is he only mentioned 3 times? Why does the text give him 3 verses in Genesis and then nothing for 1,000 years? Why is he not developed, explained, elaborated upon in the hundreds of chapters that fill the space between Genesis and the Psalms? The silence is not an accident, and it is not evidence of Melchizedek's insignificance. It is, paradoxically, evidence of his significance. The contrast between Melchizedek and the Levitical priesthood is not merely a matter of detail, but of design. While the law of Moses spent hundreds of chapters defining every measurement and ritual of the tabernacle, Melchizedek's story is told in the negative space. The Levitical system was an elaborate scaffold necessary, meticulous, yet inherently temporary. Its very nature was defined by repetition, sacrifices that had to be offered year after year, and priests who had to be replaced generation after generation because of death. This constant motion was the evidence of its own insufficiency. If the Levitical system could have brought perfection, the oath of Psalm 110 would never have been sworn. A new order was required, not one of endless ritual, but one of finality, not one based on a regulation of ancestry, but on the power of an indestructible life. The priest in the order of Melchizedek, the author argues, does not repeat the offering. He makes it once. He sacrificed for their sins once for all when he offered himself. The Levitical priests had to offer sacrifices daily, first for their own sins and then for the sins of the people. The priest, after the order of Melchizedek, does not have his own sins to atone for. His sacrifice covers not a year's worth of a single nation's sins, but the full weight of human failure across all of time. And then he sits down. This detail, which the author of Hebrews highlights explicitly, is significant because the Levitical priests never sat down. There were no seats in the tabernacle or the temple. The work was never finished. The standing posture of the priests was, in architectural terms, a statement about the perpetual incompleteness of what they were doing. Every sacrifice created the need for the next sacrifice. He sat down. The work was finished. The priest in the order of Melchizedek, after making one sacrifice for sins forever, sat down at the right hand of God, the posture of completion. The posture of Psalm 110:1, sit at my right hand. The sitting and the priesthood of Psalm 110 are connected. The one who sits is the one who is the priest forever, in the order of Melchizedek. There is a phrase in Hebrews chapter 7 that does not receive the attention it deserves. The author is explaining why Jesus qualifies as a priest in the order of Melchizedek, why he can hold a priestly office that is explicitly not available to anyone from the tribe of Judah under the Mosaic law. And he says this, one who has become a priest, not on the basis of a regulation as to his ancestry, but on the basis of the power of an indestructible life. An indestructible life. This is the quality that distinguishes the Melchizedekian priesthood from the Levitical priesthood. The Levitical priests held their office on the basis of ancestry and for the duration of their lives. When a Levitical high priest died, another had to be appointed in his place. The priesthood continued, but the priest was replaced. The office survived the death of its holder only by passing to a successor. The priest, after the order of Melchizedek, holds the office on the basis of an indestructible life, a life that death cannot terminate, a priesthood that does not need to be passed on because the priest never stops being the priest. This is why Melchizedek's lack of recorded death is so important. The author of Hebrews is not claiming that Melchizedek was literally immortal. He is observing that the biblical text presents him as a priest without recorded end, and using that textual silence as a prefiguration of the actual indestructibility of the priest he is pointing toward. Melchizedek's priesthood, as the text presents it, has no termination point. It simply exists. And this, the author argues, is because it was always meant to be a type, a shadow of a priesthood that genuinely has no termination point. Jesus, having been raised from the dead, dies no more. Death has no more dominion over him. His life is, in the precise sense the author of Hebrews uses, indestructible. And his priesthood, grounded in that indestructible life, continues without succession, without interruption, without the need for replacement. He always lives to intercede. This is the pastoral conclusion of the entire argument, and it is worth sitting with. The Levitical high priest interceded on behalf of Israel on the Day of Atonement once a year, for as long as he lived. When he died, a new high priest took over the intercession. There was never a moment when Israel was without a high priest. But there were transitions, gaps, the handoffs between priests. The priest, after the order of Melchizedek, is always alive. There is no handoff, no transition, no moment when the intercession lapses. He always lives to intercede for those who come to God through him. The past 2,000 years of human history, whatever they have contained, every prayer offered, every crisis faced, every sin confessed, every moment of despair or doubt or failure have all taken place under the continuous, uninterrupted intercession of the one who holds his priesthood on the basis of an indestructible life. Return, now, to that meeting on the road outside Salem. Abram coming back from the battle, tired, probably, covered in the dust of a military campaign. He has just defeated 4 kings and recovered the captives of Sodom, including his nephew. He is returning in victory, but he is still a man without land, without an heir, without any visible evidence that the promise he left his homeland for is going to be kept. And this figure meets him. Melchizedek brings out bread and wine, blesses him, receives 1/10 of everything. What was Abram experiencing in that moment? He had just survived a battle. He had exercised his own strength, his own resources, his own military capability, and he had won. The king of Sodom was about to offer him a reward, all the goods he had recovered. In the verses immediately after the Melchizedek encounter, Abram refuses the king of Sodom's offer. He will not take anything from the king of Sodom, he says, so that the king of Sodom cannot say that he made Abram rich. The blessing and the provision are to come from God Most High, the maker of heaven and earth, not from a human king. Something happened in that encounter with Melchizedek that clarified something for Abram. The blessing of the priest of God Most High, the priest of the one who made heaven and earth, was worth more than the reward of the king of Sodom. And receiving that blessing, acknowledging it with a tithe, was a statement about where Abram's prosperity actually came from and where his loyalty actually lay. The encounter is a moment of reorientation. After the battle, in the moment of victory, Abram does not elevate his own victory. He accepts the blessing of someone greater. He gives away 1/10 of everything to acknowledge that his victory was not ultimately his. And the bread and wine offered by a king priest to a returning warrior on the road outside the city that would become Jerusalem sits in the narrative like a seed, waiting for the soil of centuries to develop around it before it can be understood fully. The bread and the wine that would be taken at a table in that same city and given a new name. It is worth being precise about what the argument from Melchizedek does and does not claim. The author of Hebrews is not arguing that Melchizedek was divine. He is not claiming that Melchizedek was a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus, what theologians call a Christophany. He is working with a concept that is central to biblical interpretation, typology. A type is a person, event, or institution in the earlier part of the biblical narrative that corresponds to and prefigures something in the later part. The type is real in itself. It is not merely a symbol or a metaphor, but its full significance is not visible until the antitype of the thing it prefigures arrives. Adam is a type of Christ, the first Adam and the last Adam, as Paul puts it. The Passover lamb is a type of Christ. John the Baptist says this explicitly. The tabernacle is a type. The author of Hebrews develops this at length. The Day of Atonement is a type. The manna in the wilderness is a type. Melchizedek is a type, a historical figure who was the king priest of ancient Salem, who blessed Abraham, who received a tithe, and whose role in the text, whose very presentation, without genealogy and without recorded death, was structured to prefigure the priest who would come later. The author of Hebrews does not argue that Melchizedek and Jesus are the same person. He argues that Melchizedek was made to look like the Son of God, resembling the Son of God. He remains a priest forever because he was designed by divine providence to be the image of something that had not yet arrived. This is a sophisticated literary and theological claim. It requires trusting that the author of Genesis knew what he was doing when he presented Melchizedek without genealogy in a text that otherwise tracks lineage with obsessive care. It requires trusting that the silence, the absence of birth narrative, of death notice, of any mention of what happened to him after Genesis 14 was intentional. That the gaps are the message. For the author of Hebrews, writing to Jewish Christians who were deeply familiar with the Hebrew Scriptures, this argument would have been both challenging and compelling. It was challenging because it required a rereading of the entire Levitical system, not as the final word on how human beings approach God, but as a chapter in a longer story. And it was compelling because the Psalm 110 prophecy, the divine oath that someone from David's line would be a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek, had always been there, unexplained, waiting for someone to come along who fit the description. We have not yet addressed the question that has generated perhaps the most debate across the centuries. Who exactly was Melchizedek? The range of answers is remarkable. The most straightforward reading, and the one that has the most support from the text of Genesis itself, is that Melchizedek was a historical human being, a genuine Canaanite king who ruled Salem around 2000 BC, who worshipped the God whom Israel would come to know as Yahweh under the universal name El Elyon, and whose combination of royal and priestly functions, while unusual, was not impossible in the ancient world. On this reading, Melchizedek is a human figure whose unique textual presentation, no genealogy, no birth, no death, is a literary device that the author of Genesis employed deliberately to signal his typological significance. A second answer, developed in Jewish tradition and found in the Book of Jubilees and other Second Temple texts, identifies Melchizedek as Shem, the son of Noah, who would have been alive during the time of Abraham. According to the biblical chronology, Shem is presented in the genealogies as a righteous figure who would have been the oldest living human being in Abraham's time. On this reading, when Abram encounters Melchizedek, he is encountering the oldest living descendant of Noah, a kind of living embodiment of the covenant faithfulness that survived the flood. A third answer is the one developed by the Qumran community. Melchizedek is an angelic or heavenly being, a divine warrior who presides over the final judgment. This reading takes the absence of genealogy and the absence of death not as literary devices, but as literal descriptions of a non-human figure. A fourth answer found in some early Christian writers identified Melchizedek with the Holy Spirit or with a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ. The author of Hebrews, interestingly, does not answer the question of Melchizedek's identity. He does not say who Melchizedek was. He says what Melchizedek was like, resembling the Son of God, and he uses what the text says and what the text does not say to build his argument. Whether Melchizedek was a Canaanite king, the patriarch Shem, or an angelic being, the textual argument of Hebrews 7 works the same way. What matters is not the metaphysical identity of the figure, but the shape of his presentation in the text. There is something almost deliberate about this theological restraint. The mystery is preserved. The question is not answered. And perhaps that is because the mystery itself is part of the point. Melchizedek's inexplicability, his refusal to be fully categorized, his resistance to the genealogical logic that governs everything else in his world, is not a problem to be solved. It is a feature of his typological function. He is supposed to be unexplainable within the Levitical framework. He exists precisely to point beyond it. Step back and look at the shape of the whole. A man named Abram, who has just won a battle and is returning through the ancient landscape of what will one day be the Holy Land, is met by a figure who blesses him, shares bread and wine with him, and receives his tithe. The figure's name means King of Righteousness. He rules a city whose name means peace. He is a priest of God Most High. He has no recorded beginning and no recorded end. He disappears as quietly as he arrived. 1,000 years later, a king sitting in the city that was built on the ground where Salem stood writes a psalm in which God swears an oath. Someone from this king's line will be a priest forever. Not in the system that rules this city now, but in a different order, the order of the King of Righteousness, the priest of God Most High, the man without beginning or end. 500 years after that, in Babylon, in Alexandria, in the synagogues scattered across the diaspora, Jewish scholars wrestle with that single line of the psalm. What does it mean? Who is this priest? When will he come? How can someone from Judah be a priest if the law says only Levites can be priests? In the 2nd and 1st centuries BC, at a settlement near the Dead Sea, a community produces a document suggesting that Melchizedek is a cosmic figure who will preside over the final judgment of the world. And then, in a letter addressed to Jewish Christians who are being pressured to return to the Levitical system, to the temple, the priesthood, the sacrifices, the annual Day of Atonement, a writer sits down and says, "Look at what was always there. Look at what Genesis recorded and did not explain. Look at what the Psalm declared by divine oath. The system you are being pressured to return to was never the final word. It was always pointing here, to the one who holds his priesthood not by lineage, but by an indestructible life, to the one who offered himself once for all and sat down, to the one who always lives to intercede, to the priest in the order of Melchizedek." The 3 verses in Genesis 14 were never small. They were planted there in the oldest layers of the text as a seed whose fruit would take 2,000 years to appear. The silence between them and Psalm 110 was the silence of preparation. The silence between Psalm 110 and the letter to the Hebrews was the silence of waiting. The waiting was not empty. It was full of the Levitical system doing what it was designed to do, full of the prophets describing what was coming, full of communities like Qumran sensing that the story was not finished. And then the thing arrived that the silence had been preparing for. Not a priest from Levi, not a king from Saul's line, not a conqueror who would liberate Israel from Rome the way the Maccabees had liberated them from Antiochus. A priest after the order of Melchizedek, King of Righteousness, King of Peace, without the beginning that lineage would require, without the end that death would impose. The one whom Melchizedek had been waiting to resemble. On the night before he died, in the city that was built on the ground where Melchizedek had been king, Jesus took bread and broke it. He took a cup of wine and said, "This is the new covenant in my blood." The Last Supper was a Passover meal. That much is clear and universally acknowledged. But there is another layer, older than Passover, that the Last Supper also contains. The bread and the wine of Melchizedek offered to the returning warrior outside the gates of Salem reappear in the upper room. And the one who takes them and gives them new meaning is the priest in the order of Melchizedek, offering, for the last time, the meal that his predecessor had offered on the road outside the city. There is a tradition in Christian worship that goes back to the earliest liturgical sources, the Eucharist, the Thanksgiving, the breaking of bread, in which believers receive bread and wine as the body and blood of Christ. The Catholic and Orthodox traditions, in particular, describe the priest at the altar as offering in the order of Melchizedek. The ancient Roman canon of the Mass prays that God would accept the offerings as he accepted the offering of Melchizedek, the high priest. Whether one stands inside that liturgical tradition or outside it, the theological point is the same. The bread and wine on the table in every church that practices communion are not only a memorial of the Last Supper, they are a recapitulation of something older, the meal shared on the road outside Salem, between the priest of God Most High and the Father of Nations, before the Levitical system existed, before the law was given, before the temple was built. The order of Melchizedek preceded the law, and the author of Hebrews argues that it outlasts the law as well. The law was the middle chapter. Melchizedek and the priest who fulfills his order are the beginning and the end of the story. The ancient king of peace and righteousness who blessed Abraham, and the eternal priest who holds his office by a life that death could not keep. 3 verses in Genesis, 1 line in the Psalms, and an indestructible life that carries the priesthood forward beyond the reach of time. The mystery of Melchizedek is more than a historical puzzle. It is an invitation to see the deeper patterns woven into the very fabric of the Word. If this journey through the shadows of Genesis and the heights of Hebrews has deepened your understanding of the story we are all a part of, consider sharing this exploration with someone else. There are many who read these ancient texts without seeing the architectural beauty hidden beneath the surface. To continue going deeper into the types and shadows of the Scriptures, please subscribe and join our community of students of the Word. The story is far from over, and the text always rewards the patient seeker. Thank you for watching, and stay close as we continue to uncover the treasures of the great narrative.